Thanks, Sarah. Well, welcome everyone. We appreciate everybody joining us at this late-breaking session. I really do want to thank Sarah and David for the last-minute support as we when this document came out, we immediately reached out to them and they were perfectly supportive of us being able to do this, so we appreciate that. Also wanted to thank Pamela. Although I'm doing the opening on this session, Pamela did almost all the work. It's a wonderful slide deck as we go through this. It'll probably be a really helpful tool back at your institutions, and so feel free to use it as you wish. And I don't remember whether we announced this formally, but we are going another 15 minutes. So if you're available, we're going to go from 3 o'clock all the way to 4:15, and that means there'll be a 15-minute break before the next session. Next slide, please. You'll note this is a session description. We have a lot more content than we can likely cover in an hour. But what we felt was most important is to put the materials together in a way that really promotes awareness, and pushing us all towards a greater understanding what this document is trying to do, and then ultimately help work with the FDP, with the various committees and our federal partners to provide some input. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through this, because this truly is a unique opportunity, we hope, for the community to provide input in this area. Next slide, please. So some of you in some other sessions may have had an opportunity to do a thought exchange. Lynette has helped us create one. You can see the link there on the screen. You can open up another session and click on that. And I think it'll be in the chat, I think. Is that correct? I don't see the chat on my screen. Yeah, it'll be in the chat. In fact, it's already there. So you all can go right into the chat. You can click on that. And if you haven't used Thought Exchange before, it's just an opportunity to respond to some very brief demographic questions and then provide input and insights into the topics related to NSPM-33. And then you have the ability to go in and prioritize your thoughts as well as others' thoughts to help us understand what are the highest priority. So please take the opportunity throughout this session, as well as after the session. We'll leave this open for some time so that you can go back and provide more input. Next slide, please. As we talked about briefly in yesterday's session, if you joined us for the Foreign Influence Working Group, where we focused on KIC and MART, and also had Gene Feldman and Michelle Bowles join us, we talked a bit about what this NSPM-33 document is. And we talked about how 90 days ago, OSTP released, Dr. Landa released a blog and talked about this process and promised that within 90 days that some additional guidance would come forth. And that's what this document was that came out within the last week. And the initial blog posting, which is linked above, talked about 3 sections: disclosure, oversight and enforcement, and research security programs. We'll talk a bit more. The document that ultimately came out has insights in those 3 sections as well as 2 additional sections. Next slide. I think this next slide is, as Pamela and I were preparing for this and looking back at the prior presentations that we've made on foreign influence and research security, and there's probably been 8 or 10 since the fall of 2018 when much of this started. We did a number of thought exchanges, and this is the word cloud that was created by a thought exchange from August of 2020. So again, we had a thought exchange. We talked about foreign influence. We talked about what were the critical areas of interest, and you can see right in the middle is harmonization. Obviously, it's been a theme for years on lots of different topics, but one that was really important in this area, as well as reducing administrative burden And what you'll see as we talk through the NSPM-33 document, those areas are on the forefront of some of the discussion. So we really appreciate the community in providing this input, and certainly appreciate Michelle and Jean and Rebecca and Bindu and all of our federal partners in taking the input from FDP and others as they consider these important issues. Next slide. So very briefly, these are the links to the document. If you haven't had a chance to read them or download them, these are the links. We'll talk in a bit, but it's critical to understand what these documents are, and they are guidance to the agencies. So this is not a document from OSTP to the community yet. This is more to the agencies talking through those critical areas, and in the coming months, and within 120 days, as we'll talk about soon, there'll be a lot more guidance forthcoming from the agencies. Next slide. What Pamela and I wanted to do in these next two slides is discuss some of the takeaways. I have a friend at Duke that used to say this is kind of the end at the beginning, and this is kind of the end at the beginning. So we're going to go through. Initially, I think Pamela created 5, and then it was 10, and then we capped it at 11. It could easily be many more than that, but what we tried to do is really call this down to 11 items that were the critical takeaways that are the themes throughout this document. And Pamela and I are going to quickly go through each one of these as we set up kind of the context and the discussion for the remaining slides. The first element I've already mentioned, this theme of, it's throughout the document, of harmonization and reduction of administrative burden. And as Pamela annotated with the FDP symbol, you'll see that throughout. It's a unique opportunity for us to continue to partner and collaborate with the federal partners as we go through this. Pamela?
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. Another theme that is so clear in the document is that the agencies have, or OSTP has really heard us say that we want clear expectations. We want to know what we're supposed to disclose, or what programs we're supposed to have, or how we're supposed to train. And we'll talk about how they've achieved that, but we're basically, there's a great deal of focus on that. Now, as Jim said, first, that focus is going to be for the agencies and what they need to do to bring this to life. And then, of course, the agencies will be distributing that to us. It is really kind of a whole nice life cycle, in that in addition to those expectations being clear and being disclosed to all of the relevant partners, then it's clear what we're supposed to be training on, what the expectations and roles and responsibilities are for researchers and for recipient organizations in terms of training. And then what has to be disclosed ultimately to the federal agencies or locally to our organizations, and what people need to be aware of to be able to do this successfully. And finally, they do have the section on enforcement, and that's also something that we've really wanted to understand, is what are the consequences if we don't get this right, so that we understand what to expect. So we really saw that that was a theme.
The next one, number 3, actually, before I go into number 3, I should have mentioned before, Laurie is going to help us manage the QA, questions and answers. So feel free to jump in. And I think, is it correct, Pamela, they should go into Q&A, not chat? Correct. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so feel free now throughout to provide any questions, thoughts you have, any questions you have. And Laurie's going to help us kind of manage that. As Pamela and I talked about the time management here, we're going to get to what we can get to, but all of these will be documented and shared prospectively with our federal partners as we look through this. And so feel free to start asking those questions. Back to number 3. So, you know, in a lot of in prior communication, I think around other support, there's this concept of true, accurate, and complete. Here is complete, current, and accurate. And this really gets at the heart of what a little bit was mentioned in number 2, because it really talks about what is the researcher's responsibilities, the organization's responsibility, and the enforcement related to the various parties in communicating the information. So that'll be a topic we discuss throughout.
One of my very favorite parts of the guidance was this next part, that although much of this was guidance to agencies, there was one part that was mandated, and it was that anything that gets done in this space must have an unequivocal commitment to non-discrimination and fair treatment. And that was so nice to see, that there shouldn't be bias based on national background or gender or anything else, but that there is a commitment to equal and fair treatment for every single member of our research community. And that, I think, signals to all of us, right, that the way that this will be approached will be the correct way.
This next element is really in the wheelhouse of Laurie, Amanda, and Robin. If you saw our session yesterday, we talked about Kick and Mart. We talked about, you know, potential opportunities to leverage information and data points in different systems, and we talked about DPIs and other aspects of that. And Laurie is going to take a couple of minutes today to specifically talk about that section, but it really provides an opportunity for us to leverage the data points that are out there in a much more efficient way than creating all of this information from scratch. So we'll talk about that shortly as well. Next slide.
The next one is simply something that we've been expecting would come out, and it did, that it will be required across all agencies that if a researcher is involved or has applied to a foreign talent program, that the agency knows about that. It does not mean that they will necessarily be stopped from getting research funding. But that's going to add a note of transparency, and hopefully will also help manage national perceptions that perhaps people are not entirely being complete in what they're disclosing. Now they'll be asked to, but it will also be clear that they need to. And that has not historically always been as clear as it might have been.
The next element that we wanted to make sure people were clear on is the enforcement. Pamela mentioned it a little bit ago, but there's the beginning of clarity around enforcement for an individual faculty member that doesn't disclose everything, and enforcement for an institution if they didn't fulfill their responsibilities related to training and communication and appropriate internal controls and oversight. So there's clarity around that, and that's really moving in a direction that'll really help us manage the risk in this space and ensure that there's appropriate accountability.
Building on that theme, some of the transparency information sharing is what Jim just said and what we were talking about relative to foreign talent programs. But some of this also has to do with agencies sharing information among themselves and under what circumstances that can and should occur. We note that there's going to be a continued tension, we'll talk about this, between privacy of individuals or organizations, and particularly the focus here in our heads is about mid-inquiry, before there is a final result of something that's being looked into. And as I said, we'll talk more about that.
Number 9 is about funding. This document is very explicit that funding is not really discussed or contemplated here. That's critical because we all know that the solution for this, transparent reporting, is not free. It's not free for the agencies. It's not free for the institutions. It's not free for the faculty from a burden standpoint. But it's important to understand that that is not being contemplated at this point within this document.
We also note that areas that have historically given us some challenge in terms of understanding what our expectations are, we have some more work to do. So the definitions for consulting and gifts, we think are going to continue to need further refinement and clarification, but we also think that they've gone quite a ways down the path in terms of trying to help with what the expectations are. And much of what we see, we really like.
And the last thing that Pamela and I wanted to talk about was one of the three critical things that Dr. Collins communicated in August of 2018, and that is kind of the sanctity of the peer review process and how that's important. And so that is a critical element throughout this document. Next slide. So again, what we wanted to try to do there was give you an overview. You're going to hear those themes throughout the next hour as we go through this. But here's a little bit more setup before I turn it over. Again, as we mentioned, there's, well, as you'll see in two slides, there's 5 sections, but a little bit more preamble. As I mentioned, Dr. Lander in this document talked about directing federal agencies to work together in the next 120 days. And so as we heard from Michelle Bowles and Gene Feldman yesterday, that's exactly what they've been doing and they will continue to do. And as you can see in the 3 bullets below, there is some explicit guidance about what the expectations are with regard to working together going forward. Next slide. So the purpose of the document is very clear, and you can see in that top bullet, it is not binding any specific agencies. There's lots of discussion about harmony. There's lots of desire for harmony and common definitions and common forms. Everyone knows how that's important from an effectiveness and efficiency standpoint, but it does state that it does not bind the individual agencies. But as you can see in the next bullet, there is an expectation that the NSTC will be responsible for coordinating all this. So again, we heard it loud and clear about the collaboration thus far between NIH and NSF. We know it's beyond that, and we hope that it continues. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there were 3 items mentioned in Dr. Lander's blog in August. Now there's 5 areas of explicit focus within this document. Number 2 and number 4 are new. And what we plan on doing here shortly is going through each of the highlights of each of these sections. Next slide. Also in the document is, as you can see, it's in quotes, is very explicit guidance about the agencies engaging with the research community, again, right in the wheelhouse of FPP, and hopefully testing, piloting, and soliciting feedback. So there'll be a lot more to come in this space. In fact, we've had some initial thoughts, and I think it's fine for you all to plan that we will be having more discussions, more detailed discussions on these issues in February timeframe, at least once and maybe multiple times to make sure that we get input from the community. Next slide. Okay, before I hand it over to Pamela to go into the first section, you can see it continues to talk about reducing administrative burden, and it continues to talk about a risk-based perspective. That was this risk-based perspective is something that came up from OSTP in the report that they issued at the last administration. And so that continues to be a theme throughout. And as you can see in that very last bullet, and as Pamela mentioned in the overview, it's very clear about not stigmatizing or treating unfairly members of any community. Or any ethnic or racial minority group, which is so critical to this. As we've talked through this, it's important that all members of the community are supported. Next slide. Pamela. Pamela, can you hear me?
All right. Sorry, I was talking to myself. So, thanks, Jim. So what we're going to do now is go through each one of those 5 sections, and we're going to delve into the details of what each says. The longest part here is the disclosure requirements. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me because you're going to have the next 20 minutes or so of just dealing with what's included in this particular section. I did want to share with you that all of the sections have a really nice approach of starting with an objective for that particular section, and then you can see how OSTP intends for that objective to be fulfilled. I think collectively we've been hungry for a long time for details. How do we get to standardization? How do we get to harmonization? What exactly should we be disclosing or doing? And this document, I think, really delivers with respect to all of that. It delivers us from maybe the 35,000 foot level to a 10,000 foot level, or maybe even a 5,000 foot level. Yes, there's still going to be a lot more work to be done in terms of actual documents, forms, requirements, but it really provides the guideposts for how that's supposed to look. And I think we're all going to find it really helpful. One thing that's been pleasing on this is that the requirements and the definitions harmonize extremely well to Section 223 of the National Defense Authorization Act from 2001. And also the original NSPM-33 document about what should we be expecting. And we know that NIH and NSF have been working on this in great detail and trying to get to uniformity for a long time. And it really builds off of what they've already done. I did want to point out as we go through this that COGR has also done a lot of work in this area in the last week since the guidance came out. And so Chris West and her colleagues already did a great session on it, but they also have really good information on their website too. And so you might want to look at COGR, cogr.edu website and pick up some of their documents and requirements as well. So let's get into the details. So you can see the disclosure requirements. This is what they're going to share with us in this particular section. Next slide. There was really significant good news here, kind of bolstered by an overall commitment to standardization found in the general text of the document. Although there are a few places where it maybe doesn't go quite as far as we would wish. I think we'd all understand that realistically, there needs to be the possibility of deviations that are required, for example, by statute or regulation to whatever is harmonized. I suppose we could still ask, well, can we go back and look at regulations and see if they could become more standardized? But we understand that there may be a need for differentiation there, and we need to be prepared to support that. And I think that we all support the need for the deviations that you see in B there, that there may be a need for more stringent protections for R&D that's classified, for example, export control, or in some other way. We don't want to have the model forms go to the level of the worst common denominator. So it's nice that there can be some variation that respects the fact that there may be exceptions to a norm. I'm a little bit worried about C, just because it does talk about other compelling reasons, and I don't know enough about what that really means in terms of the degree of flexibility that individual agencies have to move away from a standardized or harmonized process. But as Jim pointed out earlier, there is this discussion about they need to coordinate through NSTC, and that that'll really help in terms of making sure that it's as coordinated as it possibly can be. And I think FDP too here really wants to be a force for encouraging that type of activity. Next slide. So it tells us who has to disclose. And I don't think for us that there's really any major surprise here for the sponsored project realm. but it may represent a change for some others in the research enterprise. Because you'll see there, you'll notice that program officers, intramural researchers, peer reviewers, advisory committee members are also now going to need to disclose either all or some of this. For your information, the peer reviewers and advisory committee members, if you're faculty and serve in that capacity, you're only going to have to disclose those first 3 items. You will not have to disclose current and pending or other support as a part of your peer review responsibilities. I want to note too that foreign talent recruitment program won't be new, of course, for NIH, but it may be new for some of the other agencies. And we're going to talk about that later in the presentation. Next slide. So the good news is that we have this very clear expectation that the forms and the formats are going to be standardized across research agencies to the greatest extent practical. That's super positive. And also that first part that you see, if agencies are using standard requirements, they're supposed to be collecting identical data elements. And that, I think, too, is very positive for us. I don't think the NDA definition of who is a covered individual will be a surprise to us, because that basically translates to PIs and other senior key personnel, if I can say it. They meet the definition already there, and then they're designated by the agency as that being applicable. The other nice thing here, and we'll talk about this a little bit more too, is that students are likely not, are expected not to be so covered. But the templates here, there is the expectation that we'll be creating templates. Not we will, they will be for bias sketches and current and pending and other supports or other forms. And so that's, again, going to be something that's going to help push the standardization effort overall. Next slide. So it's not going to, it's probably going to be a little bit easier for NIH and NSF than some of the other agencies. But there are, even with NIH and NSF, continued desire, and they're clearly working to try to bring their requirements even closer together than they already are. I'm going to talk about the foreign talent program later, so I'll hold off on that one. We certainly do expect to have in the reporting, both for current and pending support, for annual project reports, post-award terms and conditions, that we will need to report visiting scholars, students, and postdocs that are funded by an organization other than our own organization. Now, some of the variations that we already have today, such as whether there's a time commitment involved or whether the individual is working in a lab, aren't defined in this guidance. So that may be coming as part of the instructions, or it may simply be more broad. We don't know the outcome of that yet. I will note that if you look up the definition of current and pending support in the guidance document, this guidance document, it's really broad. It includes financial support for laboratory personnel and participation of student and visiting researchers supported by other sources of funding. So it doesn't have the limiters that we've seen, for example, that NSF has used. We're probably still going to have some questions here. For example, if company A were to give the university, like, let's say funding for 5 fellowships, but we get to pick who those fellows are. Well, are we going to have to report that because it's a source of outside support, as opposed to when company A is helping to underwrite a specific statement of work or a specific project, which is pretty clear that for sure it would need to be reported. So I think we'll have some questions, but that's fine. In general, again, it's pretty clear here what we need to do. I thought it was extremely helpful that the guidance talks about that we're supposed to report paid consulting instead of all consulting, and that we don't need to report consulting that's permitted under our outside activities rules at our own institutions. So we'll only have to report if somebody's outside of bounds of our institutional policy. And again, that's going to help with the clear roles and responsibilities when we get that far. Next slide. This might be a little bit new. So in this, we're talking about for financial conflict of interest. Now, not necessarily reports that would go into applications or progress reports or just in times, but for financial conflict of interest reporting, it should include private equity, venture, or capital financing. It's possible that agencies will ask that we submit that both to them and to the home organization. So that also is something where I think details will need to be worked out, and we'll need to understand the extent to which this really does represent a change to what we already do. But it's likely, I think, that there will be some change in this particular area. Next slide. All right, let's talk about what we don't have to disclose. There's this nice list, including that appealing exclusion about consulting. I think maybe we're still a little bit unclear what the expectations are going to be for 9-month faculty and what needs to be reported and what doesn't need to be reported and to whom, really related to the times when they're not under contract with their home organization. I think the direction, though, has been more and more that if one receives federal funding at any point during the year, you're disclosing, in essence, all of your year. We'll see if that actually comes out in terms of the in specific instructions, and we'll probably be asking some more questions about that. We've been talking about that with FDP's Connect the Dots sessions, and so that isn't a surprise that we need some more clarification there. Overall, though, this standardization is going to bring really welcome clarity. And we'll talk about a couple of these topics like gifts a little bit later. Next slide. Okay, so I wanted to talk about consulting a little bit because there's a footnote on one of the slides that you see here. I've just quoted it verbatim. And it's pretty clear that one thing that this footnote is trying to tell us is that researchers may not get around reporting their involvement in a foreign talent recruitment program by choosing to label it consulting, which doesn't have to be reported. That's within the scope of their outside activities. So that point is taken. But I think it's less clear what to do about characterizing research activities that are consulting. I think a significant number of us allow our faculty or support our faculty in engaging in research activities when they're consulting. And particularly if they're involved in startup companies or they're participating maybe in a company's research activities. So I don't know exactly what this footnote is intended to say to us. It might be as simple as reminding us that our financial conflict of interest reporting needs to make sure and include that type of reporting. But I do think, again, this is since it does talk about should not inappropriately characterize research activities as consulting, we need to understand what that means and make sure that we're on the same page with the federal agencies relative to that. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about those foreign disclosures for a minute. So it basically gives us instructions that we're supposed to disclose applications or participation in programs sponsored by foreign governments, et cetera. Okay, so two things here. First of all, notice that it says applications. So now I think before, when we have reported or have started to report fairly recently for sure, participation in foreign government recruitment programs, it's been actual participation in those programs. This is clear that it also includes any applications to those programs. So we'll probably end up needing to make some adjustments there. The larger issue for all of us, I think, is going to be identifying for our faculty what constitutes those programs. Which ones are the programs sponsored by foreign governments, instrumentalities, or entities associated directly or indirectly with the foreign government, the definition there. I don't know how to tell which of those programs fit within those definitions or not. I think we're going to need help with that. Now, it's possible, and you see that second bullet point there, that it might not matter as much, because if the basically if involvement in that foreign talent recruitment program already includes an affiliation or an appointment or other support through that program, we should be reporting it anyway. And so, or already we're required to report it. But I think still we'll want to get more to the bottom of this and understand not so much the definition, because they've done a good job with the definition, but understanding how do we go about discerning whether or not any given program meets this definition or doesn't meet the definition. Next slide. I'm sorry, I told you guys this was kind of a slog through this, because there's an awful lot. Again, they've brought us down to that 5,000 or 10,000 foot level, which has been really hugely helpful. But now we're really looking at it to understand completely what our obligations and expectations are. So the gift definition is one of those places. Note that first part. It says that compensation or consideration that are provided with term and conditions and in support of R&D activities are not considered gifts. Well, I know some of our gifts certainly do come with terms and conditions, not sponsored projects terms and conditions, but terms and conditions that are allowed for gifts under IRS regulations. And we know that in some cases, our faculty choose to use their gifts to further their R&D activities. So I think, again, we're going to need to understand from the agencies, what do they mean by terms and conditions? If they're talking about terms and conditions that we would consider go with sponsored projects, like rebudgeting restrictions, IP terms, return of funds, then I think we're all going to be on the same page with this guidance. But I think we need to understand that and know if they're talking any term and condition at all, or those ones that would basically, from our standpoint, declassify it as a gift in any case. The other thing that you should be aware of relative to this is that there is a definition of gift in the guidance, and it's really broad. It includes things like gratuity, favor, discounts, entertainments, loans, forbearance, licenses, samples, anything that has monetary value. And it also includes services like training, travel, local travel, lodging, meals, research hours. So I think, again, this is an area that we will, over the coming weeks and months, be looking at more closely to see whether or not there's any education, if nothing else, that we need to do with people to help them be able to disclose accurately and completely. Next slide. All right, let's talk about when disclosures have to happen. Again, I don't think for much of this, it's going to be a surprise. There needs to be, the guidance says there needs to be an initial disclosure and updates. It does not define, or an original disclosure, I should say. It does not say exactly when that original disclosure has to be. So the good news there is it could be at proposal time or at just in time, or whenever the agency tells us we should be doing it. It indicates that updates should, now note it says should, not must, but should occur prior to support annually or more frequently or promptly as needed. There is the last two bullets here that may be either new or a bit more refinements from today's practices. This is probably going to be one of those devil in the details sort of things. Certainly, if we're changing from one PI to another, we're already having, so we changed to covered personnel, and that person in that case, we're already having to do disclosures as part of that PI change. But it's unclear whether everything that we do today is already included in these definitions or not. I think that condition of receiving a final increment of funds is very interesting because it does seem to indicate that we might have to refresh everything before we can finish getting paid. And we'll have to see how that plays out in practice. Next slide. One of the really other great things in here is the agencies are asked to make sure that we have a process for corrections. That process is going to be required. And I think that we all should be very pleased with that outcome. It also indicates that it's supposed to be simple and straightforward and communicated clearly about when and how you do that. It needs to be at both the pre-award and the post-award stage. So if you catch an error early, you report it then, but there's also an opportunity after award. And so it will also allow for self-disclosure. And as we're going to see later in the enforcement section, self-disclosure is going to matter. So this was something that I think was very positive in the guidance to make sure that if a mistake is made, it can be corrected. Next slide. Okay, we're down to the end of disclosures. You'll probably be glad to hear that. But one last point on this, and that is that the NSDC subcommittee that put out the guidance in the first place intends to provide standardized certification language for agencies and organizations to use. And I think, again, that's very positive. Obviously, we'll want to take a look at that language and see if it's clear to us, or if we have any questions, or if we want to ask for any clarifications. But that seems extremely promising that we will have standard certification language. So in part, we can understand what we're signing up to, but we can also help educate our researchers about what that means and what they're certifying to as we complete our disclosures. So enough about disclosures for the moment. I'm gonna let's talk about the future. Lori's going to cover digital persistent identifiers. Lori?
Thank you, Pamela. You know, we have gotten a few questions that have been answered in the Q&A. If you want me to run through those really quickly before we move on to the next topic. I think that some of it is just in verifying that, yes, we still need clarification on some things. Like, we know there is more than one definition of foreign talent program out there. And while the OSTP guidance does have a definition in the appendix, we want to make sure we're on the same page. We also want to make sure we're on the same page with how we treat gifts versus grant, because every single one of us, that's been a topic on our campuses since before we heard the term undue foreign influence. So it's like, so yeah, I think that there are a lot of things that that definitely require clarification and a check on our own processes to make sure we're doing the right thing. And then, you know, another question about the idea that outside consulting that is inside your institutional policies and okay with your institutional policies wouldn't have to be disclosed. I think all of us are still in the place of saying, for really? Is that true, really? So
I think that's why that footnote threw us off a little bit, right? Because it's not entirely clear if that was intended to somehow change that, or whether, you know, that really had an entirely different purpose for us.
Yeah, for sure. So I will go ahead and talk about DPIs or PIDs. I tend to prefer the term PID, and that's only because I'm a research administrator, and what we're really good at is taking acronyms that sound like they could be pronounced like words and using them forever. So they do basically mean the same thing. A digital persistent identifier or a persistent identifier is something that in the academic landscape is an ID number that is assigned to a researcher that carries with them, it's persistent, carries with them throughout their career. So whether they are at the University of Arizona and move to the University of Minnesota, or they move elsewhere, that PID, that persistent identifier, is the same number regardless of where they go. And it is a way of collecting scholarly outputs of research, all of the things that researchers do, in a way that links up identifiers so that that chain is has some integrity. Again, the same number follows the same person, and then a different number identifies something like a publication or an output of research, so that that ID number for that digital object identifier for a publication, for instance, is linked with the DPI or PID of the author and co-authors that wrote that paper. And that's something that persists in the technology. So I wanted to explain that a little bit before I got started. And it really is the future, because it's using data in a way that systems like to use data, having persistent keys, persistent identifiers that always map back to something that is known and something that happened, a person or a thing. So what the OSTP guidance is saying is that, within a year of the date of the memo, that funding agencies need to establish policies regarding requirements for individual researchers to be registered with a service that provides a DPI or PID for that individual. Next slide, please. And what that really means is these services allow researchers to maintain information in a profile or record that they are the ones in control over, which is another thing that is part of the OSTP guidance. Researcher control of the information is very critical. They're the ones who know their research. And for those of you who have seen me talk about ORCID here at FDP and Cura and other places, it allows the researcher to be in control even as they move throughout their career from one organization to the other. That record maintains their control, and it's something that's required by this guidance. So what would happen in the workflow, in this future of technology, is that the researcher provides their PIDs, and there's an authentication process through that DPI service. Basically, like it's almost like a certification, or almost like saying this is true and accurate, and authorize the agency to access that information at the time that it is needed, whether that is at the review process or at the, like, for instance, the RPPR process. That information would be available, and there would be a way to authenticate that information was true and correct and updated at the time they were looking at it. I want to mention that there are precedences for this kind of information exchange already happening today. For those of you who are researchers or departmental research administrators who are familiar with the application Proposal Central, Proposal Central does do that. They allow you as the DRA or the PI to enter an ORCID and insert that data into the workflow as you create an idea of it then extending to other kinds of information about scholarly output and other engagement is only sort of a corollary and an extension of some of the work that already happens in the grants lifecycle. Next slide, please. So one of the things that, some of the things that the OSTP guidance says is that research agencies should provide the option of using a DPI service, but also shouldn't exclude activities that don't have a DPI. So they don't want to cut people out of it because they don't have a DPI or a PID. Research agencies aren't allowed to make particular services mandatory, meaning selecting one or the other. At least that's how I interpret that particular question. The DPI services should be provided by private entities, which is, if you know anything about the academic output space, that is how PIDs and DPIs work today, is that they're provided by entities outside of federal government agencies. Research agencies are encouraged to ensure that one or more common services is available across their agencies, and that these services have to be provided at no cost to the researcher. And what that really means is this goes back to the idea that these solutions, these systems that are created to ease the disclosure of information that's required for research security doesn't exclude people from using it and being able to take advantage of the burden reduction and ease of use of using all of these things. And that's also what the interoperability means. I talked a little bit about Proposal Central, and that is really what interoperability means, that one system can use the PID to pick up information that is tied to the PID to use it in their workflow. And that's really what we mean when we talk about interoperability. It's a big word. And the DPI should provide the lowest admin burden for researchers, research organizations and research agencies. And for me, this concept, along with interoperability, really gets back to the place where we're saying the data lives somewhere. We shouldn't have to type it in over and over again, but we should publish once and use everywhere it's needed in order to provide compliance for research security. And next slide, please. And I think that's it for me. Back to Pamela and Jim.
Thanks, Lori. So just a few quick things about the enforcement. As we talked about, the guidance has enforcement in it. And I think many of us already knew this, but it reminds us that there's criminal, civil, and administrative actions that the feds can take. It lists them out. It lists the laws, which I'm not going to go into here. But I did like the fact that the NSTC subcommittee is going to create a standard operating procedure template. So we're going to know, as well as the agencies are going to know, how the process should occur if and when there's a need to enforce the requirements. Again, I like the fact that they're going to take self-disclosure into consideration. The public disclosure part is a little bit more where it's a little uncertain because in part, it talks about kind of disclosure of trends or disclosure of pattern. And so I don't think any of us would be, we would all support that because then it will help us learn about what to look for. But it's also a little unclear about whether public disclosure can take place. It seems to indicate that it can take place during the process of investigating. And so that's a little concern, so that it's possible that there could be a researcher that is reported to another agency where in fact the fact pattern isn't complete yet. And so really there should be no judgment made until all the facts are in. And so I think we'll find out more about that as we move forward. Next slide. I'm really listing this just for posterity. The enforcement actions on the top are ones that already exist for all of our grants, of course. And it does list a series of other actions that could also be taken by the feds in respect of this. And we know at the very bottom here, it's possible that there could be a suspension or denial of Title IV funds, which of course we all care about because it's our federal financial assistance. Financial assistance to students. But there is a process for that, and includes hearings and notice. And so I think that's, and it really relates to when we fail to report under Department of Education Section 117 rules, not all of this. And so that's somewhat encouraging as well. Next slide. So it was good that they laid out what factors the feds will take into consideration as they look at individual cases of non-disclosure or non-compliance with one of the other requirements. And so I listed here what they've put in the guidance so that we could see that. When it gets to the offender's knowledge of requirements, I think they're going to be looking at how good a job did the institution or the home organization do in terms of training the individual and what the requirements actually are. We know there's an expectation that we do that, but this will be part of the factors that get evaluated if in fact there is a failure to disclose. And it does note, as I said, this is where that self-disclosure comes in, that it points out that that really will take into consideration whether or not there was a self-disclosure, and if you did it when you found out about it, or did you wait until the 11th hour and then self-disclose, that sort of thing. So this was helpful to see, and I thought positive overall. Next slide. And then finally on this topic, we got in this what we were expecting to see from earlier from Section 223 and from other documents, that the organizational responsibilities are going to be to make sure that individuals know what they are supposed to disclose. And there will be organizational consequences if we don't do that, if we haven't trained appropriately, or if we knew that somebody was not disclosing and we didn't take steps to fix it, then the organization will be held responsible. But otherwise, there will be an expectation for the individual, him or herself, to have disclosed what knowledge is in their own possession, which is useful. The other part here that's very helpful to see is that if there's going to be an action taken, we need to be notified, either the individual or the research organization or both. Don't know exactly how that's going to work yet. What specific reasons are going to be taken for the action, and also giving us an opportunity and a process by which we can contest that action. So that feels quite safe in this particular environment, that there'll be a process for remediation or correction if that need arises. So we wanted to share that with all of you. The last bullet there is, I think, intended not so much for research organizations like ours, but maybe involved with, potentially, I would think, smaller organizations or other organizations where there was some kind of a deliberate cover-up. And so I think they wanted to make sure that was covered as well. Moving on, Jim, let's talk about information sharing.
Great, thank you. You know, as Pamela and I were looking at this, these three sections, the section that Pamela just finished and these next two, which are information sharing and then research security program, should almost be kind of glommed together as you think about them, because truly the information sharing is a new section from what Dr. Landers communicated a couple months ago, but has always been something that as a community we were wondering if an institution had a problem with NIH, would it have ramifications in funding from DoD or NSF? This begins to ponder that and give some specific guidance. I think one thing that will get a lot of focus is that number 2 here is once an administrative or an enforcement action is taken. So what is that definition? Does that mean an administrative action internal to an institution? What is the definition of an administrative action from an agency perspective? Enforcement's a little clearer based on everything that Pamela just said, but I think there'll be a lot more discussion about due process and how that issue's managed. Next slide. And I think I have 5 more slides here for these 2 sections. And Lynette, if you can queue up the thought exchange in about 5 minutes, that'd be great. So this next slide is, again, as you think about some of the things that Pamela just mentioned, in that first section, it talks about agencies should share information prior to final determination. So what does that mean? Like what are the privacy implications there? What are the due process implications there? There's lots of things related to that. And as many of you know, the life cycle for these types of things, when there's maybe an initial query of information from an agency, we're not talking days or weeks. We're often talking many months or a year as there's back and forth between the faculty member, the institution, the agency. So when does that information sharing to another agency happen? And then with regard to once there's enforcement, I think SAM and FAPIS and the Federal Register as appropriate makes sense. Not exactly sure what that last bullet, the publicly sharing of information. I'm not sure if that's general numbers or general themes or kind of anonymous examples or what. I think, again, that'll be something that we kind of pull the threads on to better understand that. Next slide. So now we're transitioning to the research security program. There's been discussions of this for some time now. I forget whether it was the NDAA that first introduced this, but we knew this was coming down the pike. And what this is now clarifying is that if you have funding of greater than $50 million, not exactly sure if that's directs, if it's indirects, how that's going to be calculated. But if you meet that threshold, then there's 4 specific areas where you need to create specific program oversight for. Next slide. And I apologize that I'm kind of going through these quickly, but I do want to leave time for Q&A and a thought exchange. So one that'll be probably transformational for a lot of organizations is this foreign travel security. It's fairly explicit about what it appears that institutions will need to do. Some of these are probably best practices. Some institutions already have practices in place that if you travel to a foreign country, they will issue you a laptop or a cell phone that's appropriately secured and so forth. But there's lots of other issues here with regard to how foreign travel is going to be managed, the level of oversight and reporting of that and so forth. Next slide. So this, when we opened up in this discussion, we clarified that this is guidance for the agencies, not guidance for institutions. But as you look closely on this, in this section where it talks about research organizations and training, the actual language said that agencies should require that organizations provide training. So OSTP is using the word should to agencies, but basically suggesting that they should require that we provide training for these types of things. So a lot of organizations do this, a lot don't. Some of that training is kind of didactic and very specific. Others of it is kind of at a kind of point of operational impact where I'm working with a faculty member and in essence, I'm training on aspects where the bar is going to be set, how detailed that training needs to be, those types of things is to be defined, both for the broader research training as well as the export control. Next slide. I think real quickly here, that middle bullet is talking about standardized technical assistance to support development of training. I think that's a great offer of assistance, and especially if there's harmony across agencies, that might be really helpful. As I mentioned yesterday, many institutions still need to take somewhat standardized training and customize it to their culture and their environment and their internal control systems and so forth, but it's certainly helpful. But to me, I think one of the most important things in here is that last paragraph. And the way I read that is that the agencies need to develop solutions and engage stakeholders across the broad range. And when I hear that, we're going to be talking about institutions that have 10 or 15 or $20 million of research, all the way up to Johns Hopkins, which has over $2 billion, I think. So that's a broad range of internal control environments, of processes, of centralization and decentralization, lots of different issues there that really goes to how complex this is and how the agencies will be challenged and the institutions will be challenged to try to meet these requirements based on the breadth of the regulatory environment and how they manage their business internally. Next slide. And I think this is my last slide, Lynette, so if you can get ready to cue it up. I think the most important takeaway that I see here is there's a number of things, but there's a discussion of the organizational certification and what that means and how that applies. Do we need to have individual certifications for various forms, for various processes? Will there be one per organization? How is that applied? What is the technology that supports that for efficiency and effectiveness and so forth? But I think the other thing is that red bullet right in the middle that Pamela put in red to make it stand out. That if this becomes part of the compliance supplement, then I would imagine we should expect that elements of this will be part of possibly of the single audit, right? So we will really need to think through how do we develop all aspects of the internal control environment, the training and the roles and responsibilities and the communication and the business processes and so forth to really support this in a way that's compliant and as always, as least burdensome for our faculty as can possibly be. Next slide. And I think we're ready, Lynette, for you to give a quick update on thought exchange? And while
I
Lynette's
am ready.
queuing that up, thank you. You can go ahead and bring it up, Lynette. And again, this thought exchange will be open for some time. So please continue to provide your ideas and your input. Lynette?
All right, so here we go. And I'm going to show you guys using the back end of Thought Exchange. And I've got the right Thought Exchange up here. So hopefully I'll redeem myself from the research admin session. We had 22 thoughts, 61 participants, lots of ratings. And I'll just show you this so you can see the breakdown of who we had adding thoughts. And here's Pamela and Jim. So you guys know there are 11 people that have high familiarity with this, so they can jump in and help out. We don't know who those 11 people are, so they're going to have to self-identify. But show you a quick word cloud. Last time I looked at it, confusion was the biggest word, but this can give you an idea of course, many of the things you talked about and what we would expect. I'll show you what some of the top thoughts were here. And these have changed a little. The digital persistent identifier moved up in the rankings, but lots of coordination, clarification, consistency, harmonization, the things you would expect. I was able to theme while we went along here. So these are the themes. And of course, these are subjective. So these are the ones that I put in. And we'll start with this one. Kudos, you guys. Let's see, let's pick this one. So you can see there were lots of concerns about needing clarification, consistency between agencies. There were several comments about consulting definitions.
Yep.
There we go, another consulting, 9-month faculty. So stop me if you guys want to talk about these in any more detail. I thought this was interesting, institutional liability. And coordinating amongst our offices, of course, is always a good time. People are concerned about, and you guys talked about this, coordinating through NSTC and their authority and how that will all work. And staffing impacts. And of course, the ever popular admin burden of cost of this.
Yeah.
So I can kind of give you an idea.
That it has such enormous potential, right? And probably more potential than we've seen in a long time to really make transformative change. But the devil's in the details. So we all at FDP have to help make that happen, right? So.
And like Jim said, we'll keep this open. So.
Yeah. So for those of you that have not participated in a thought exchange, you can go in and add thoughts, and everyone can then add stars from 1 to 5, or you can go in and just rate the existing thoughts. It takes anywhere from 2 minutes to 25 minutes. But truly, there's a lot of value if you just go in there quickly. So we need everybody's input. So I would ask everybody that puts something into the Q&A that we'll document those, but those are great questions to go into the thought exchange so that we can get some insights as to the prioritization of that.
And see, I just wanted to show you how quick, you can go in and there was 3 new thoughts. I categorized them and so same rankings, but we'll be using Thought Exchange a lot more. So I think you guys will get used to it.
Thank you, Lynette.
Anything more you wanted me to show on this?
I think that's perfect. Laurie, do you have a couple of questions?
Yeah, there are a couple of open questions. One I'll go ahead and read out and attempt to answer, and I would ask Jim and Pamela to add input. But Jean asked early on if we envision that the solution of a national repository and verification might come through the FTP rather than multiple proprietary entities. And the way I would answer that is I think the FTP can help inform what that solution looks like and rely on the OSTP guidance that says that these systems should not be proprietary. Because again, making them proprietary excludes a great number of people and institutions from use. And that's kind of my answer.
I would agree with that, Lori. I think we probably want to distinguish between proprietary and private. Yeah. In that we support this happening through a private entity, especially with DPIs. And we kind of think that that's probably better for everybody, but it still needs to meet all of the requirements that you were talking about before. And as everybody here knows, I think the FTP, KIC, and MARC groups have been working to see if we can create or foster or at least contribute to something that will help make this happen in a way that's easier, faster, and more intuitive for all investigators, including those at, one thing we didn't talk too much about is many different size institutions. It needs to be something that fosters research participation from every size institution and for every researcher.
I agree. And our last question, I think, is a great wrap-up question, which is what steps should institutions be taking now before this 120 days? I have one answer that's a little bit longer than 120 days. Talk to your libraries about how you're already using DPIs on your campus if you don't know.
That's a good one. I think that's a great one. I think recognition that we will need to be doing training. We may not have the content of what that training is going to be, but that we will precisely enough to start that. But the fact that we will need to have, be able to adjust to whatever new requirements are and have an absolute expectation to do this training, I think is revving up for that is good. Jim, what do you think?
I think the only thing I'd say is, the disclosure section that Pamela went through, in some ways, we've seen those tea leaves from NIH and NSF and all their matrix and FAQs and guidance over the last couple of months. Jean and Michelle were led part of that group, and we've seen some of that. So that doesn't mean we're there yet on the disclosures, because as Laurie pointed out, there's lots of questions around lots of things, to which hopefully FTP and, as Pamela mentioned, COGR can play a part in that. But to me, it's those other sections that make it really real, right? When we start talking about research security programs, and we talk about travel, and we talk about other cultural things about how we broaden and make sure it's all more transparent, and this enforcement and sharing data and what are the implications of those things? I think those are the things that we have to continue to make sure that the culture in our institutions really understand how real this is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know we're out of time, so Sarah's going to do that. That's perfect, because we thank you all for for coming to this whirlwind tour of the new guidance. And as Jim said earlier, we will definitely be back and working to engage all of you and having other opportunities for this in the future. But as the slide earlier said, we want to thank everyone who participated today, and David and Sarah for their help in getting this up and running at the 11th hour, and Lori and Robin and Amanda and others who have helped put it together, and all of the members of our FIG working group, because they really were transformative for us.